when we were first recording it, which was 68, around then, and I started to write it in 67, a few bits and pieces from it. It grew over a period of time. What I didn't realise was that Kit Lambert, who was the producer for The Who and the manager of The Who at the time, who had come in and taken over management of The Who with his partner Chris Stamp, in the hope of becoming a filmmaker, making films about rock and roll and doing rock and roll movie projects. And as soon as I started to work on Tommy, he was very, very, very encouraging in making it as ambitious and as broad in scope as possible. He was the one that suggested it spanned a long period of time, more than a normal lifetime. He was the one that talked about it being a post two wars, a story about two wars. The First World War and the Second World War, and the inheritance that the young British public had. And almost as soon as it was finished as an album, it turned out later, had already written a screenplay, which apparently at some point, I don't really remember, Chris Stamp tells me that he flew past me, and I rejected it. I can't really work out quite why I would have rejected it or impeded him. I think the only reason I might have impeded him was because I was very close to him and very fond of him and very dependent on him emotionally, and probably was afraid that he was going to go off to Hollywood and make a film. So that's where I first heard that he'd made a script, but I'd blocked it. I blocked that movie, so Kit didn't get to make that movie. A later subtext to this is that when I came to deliver my film script to Universal, based on Lifehouse, which is the Who's music with Barbara O'Reilly, Won't Get Fooled Again, Behind Blue Eyes, that period, which is 1971, Kit, behind my back, tried to slide in the original Tommy project underneath that and cause some disarray and confusion around that time, and neither project got made. Subsequently, what caused Ken Russell to become interested in the movie much later was the fact that I gave permission to Lou Reisner to do an orchestral version, and the orchestral version was what gave Ken Russell the way in. I think if he hadn't have had the orchestral version, Ken, who was a great classical music man, wouldn't have found a way in.
So Ken actually approached you for the movie?
No, Chris Stamp was approached by the first offer that we got was through Hammer Films. They were the people that I first sat down and talked to about it. And then subsequently, and that was with Chris Stamp. Chris Stamp was our co-manager with Kit Lambert. Chris Stamp then talked to Stigwood about it, and Robert Stigwood and The Who had a long history, great friends and great allies from the very, very beginning, and so that we seemed natural partners for it.
How did the first meetings with Ken go with regards to the movie? I mean, they was a bit strange, wasn't they, the first meeting you had?
Well, I was left pretty much to my own devices. He already had a patchwork screenplay, which, what would you call it, a treatment, which I don't think he deviated from very much. But our first meeting, I went to see him he had a beautiful big house in Notting Hill Gate, and he played me lots of music. He played me lots of what you'd call sort of orchestral program music, and then we worked through. We talked a lot about music and what we shared in common in terms of orchestral music, and then we listened through to the Lou Reisner version, and then over a period of weeks, I saw him 2 or 3 more times. He produced the screenplays that we shot to. I didn't have a tremendous amount to do with it.
Did you feel that Ken was the man to bring out the spiritual elements in the story?
Oh God, no. I mean, I'm not even sure really that I was worried. But when I was making Tommy, I was very, very concerned to make sure that we dealt with something really quite deep and a few years before, or no, about a year before I'd started to write it, I'd come across an Indian spiritual master called Meher Baba and started to read about his message, and was very inspired by it. And but all around in the time, pop at the time was a lot of acid, a lot of psychedelic drugs, a lot of psychedelic imagery, a lot of hippie stuff going on. I mean, there was some fantastic stuff in there. I mean, Pink Floyd were around, the Soft Machine, Arthur Brown. There was some very, and in America there were also the equivalents over there. But the Who did not fit into that, and we'd had a very strange time. We'd had a terrific 2-year run of hit singles in the UK, and I'd kind of run out of steam. I'd just written myself out. The final song that I wrote for the Who single was that was successful was I Can See for Miles, and after that I felt I had nowhere to go. And but I felt that if we could achieve anything, if I could achieve anything, if it had a spiritual subtext, it would straddle the world of pop from which we'd come and this new hippie world that seemed to be about new age values, and well, we all know what hippies stood for. But there was another reason for the spiritual content, which was that I felt that the pop song, in a way, was designed to deal with spiritual matters. Spiritual issues with young people, that was all it was about. And that, when people say no, pop music is for singing and dancing, my response is yes, well, hey, what could be more spiritual than that, and what can be more freeing, and what can be more true to the redemption of the human spirit and difficulty, that good pop at its best frees the spirit. So was to make an album, a story which had a series of singles. And in the work that I'd seen of Ken's, Savage Messiah, the film about Elgar, which is very, very, very straight film, Delius, I saw a very, very powerful and dignified filmmaker. In the film that he made about Tchaikovsky, I saw a crazy man, somebody that used, and Richard Strauss, he made a film about him as well, with iconic imagery, and it really felt to me like what he had was a kind of a pop art knack. It seemed to me that he was the right man for the job. It was colourful, lots of, I suppose, remember this is pre-video, and it seemed to me like he had that kind of pop video approach. And he just seemed to be absolutely perfect, and I think he turned out to be perfect for the film that he made.
He changed around some of the elements of the story, particularly the scene where the lover kills the father rather than the other way around in the original. Did you need much convincing to allow him such a free rein?
Doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't matter. The point of the death of the parent is that the child thinks that the parent is the parent. It doesn't matter whether the parent is the father or the lover. All that the child knows is that the person that he thinks is his dad has been killed by somebody that he's never met before. So, as far as I was concerned, it was a fine point. I didn't argue either way. It just doesn't matter. And when we did the story on Broadway, we flipped it back again. It just really doesn't matter. I think the story has a bit more kind of resonance if the father stays with the child as he grows up. But in the modern world, what would be more... the other story is the one that's more common now, isn't it? That the single mum left behind would be with a new partner. So in a sense, in the modern world, it would work either way, really.
You were required to write some new songs for the soundtrack to the album. How did it feel to revisit Tommy some 5 years after the original release? I did the scoring for Tommy after I'd done Quadrophenia, which was very ambitious, and I'd used a lot of synthesizers in Quadrophenia, I'd used a lot of through composition, I'd done a lot of mixing themes. First ever work I'd done, this is going to sound very pretentious, but the first time I'd ever done what they call contrapuntal work, where you take 3 or 4 melodies and mix them together, and in Quadrophenia at the end there are 4 separate melodies that are combined and elegantly sit together.
So I felt very confident that I could do pretty much anything that Ken asked me to do. But there were two things going on. The key person in this whole thing is Terry Rawlings, who was my music editor. Now, Terry Rawlings is a brilliant film editor, an inspired and really generous-spirited guy. And what he did is he led me through the process of the scoring side. He made it possible he was like my Mac computer in the days before there were computers. He gave me exact timings and precise lengths for pieces that were required to bridge certain sections. He told me what their emotional content was going to need to be. He taught me, in a sense, how to please Ken, who I think he'd worked with once or twice before. Ken, on the other hand, wanted dramatic fixes. He wanted Anne Margaret to have a song about money. He wanted Anne Margaret and Oliver Reed to have a song about the evolution of the holiday camp, in which there was more to it than just da, 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 holiday camp song, you know, and quite a few chunks where he needed to bridge sections with new lyrics. And without Terry's involvement, I would have found it really, really hard. And I have to say, it was so hard, ultimately. The work was so technically difficult that when I'd finished, despite the fact that to this day, you know, I would definitely do I'm not worthy with Terry Rawlings because he's such a giant of a man. I swore I'd never make another film again as a composer, and I haven't. In fact, Terry arranged for me to read an early script of Blade Runner, and I turned it down. You know, I kind of read through it and I went, no, take it away, you know, which he edited. And I don't think I would have done a particularly good job on it anyway, and I love what Vangelis did with it. It's just wonderful. The whole thing is wonderful. But at that time, it was like I never want to see another 1 2/3 seconds timing ever again. That's what frames turn out to be: 1 2/3, 1 3/3, and 1 1/2 third. And but the songs that I wrote to order for Ken were quite easy because they had specific briefs. You know, he wanted something very specific. What I had problems with was trying to find ways to write new songs without them being too new. So instead of them just being out of the box, I had to try to use themes from elsewhere in the song collection. And because of the work that I'd done on Quadrophenia, I felt quite well equipped to do that.
As you say, before the filming had even started, you'd agreed to supervise the re-recording of the music. And you and John cut most of the basic tracks and then brought in other players?
That's right.
Why did you do that rather than just record with The Who?
There's a huge amount of work involved and a huge amount of discipline involved in it. And to cut a long story short, Keith Moon wasn't in very good shape. So we decided to... and when you say that John and I did it together, we didn't actually do it together. I did it with... John wasn't particularly involved in it. I did it with Ken. And we had a studio. While we were building that studio, when we were recording Quadrophenia with The Who, Ken was visiting, and we were doing some of the film tracks almost at the same time. You know, things were happening simultaneously. The two projects overlapped, so there was a tremendous amount of effort. And The Who were doing gigs at the time as well, so it was quite a difficult program. But the main thing is that Keith wasn't up to, if for example, when we did Sparks and Underture, where Keith could play from memory, he did a fantastic job. You know, he just played what he played. But if you started to say to him, no, this bit's going to be longer, you know, he would get frustrated. He was hanging out with Oliver Reed. He and Oliver Reed were having these absurd drinking competitions and trying to, you know, demonstrate one to the other. You know, so I can say what I like because they're both dead. They were shagging in the back, you know, they were, you know, going off to men's lavatories, pair of right queens they were. And